This is a helicopter. This is a model of that helicopter, and so is this. We're going to be looking at model helicopters in this episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat. We're going to be looking at factory display models, kit models, and stay tuned because at the end, we're going to be showing model box art. But let's start at the beginning. It all comes down to the gentleman you see at upper right, Russian-born engineer Igor Sikorsky, who designed, built, and flew the world's first successful single-rotor helicopter, the VS-300, seen at left. He made the first flight on September 14th, 1939 in Stratford, Connecticut, and although earlier helicopter designs had flown in Russia in 1932 and Germany in 1936, the VS-300 became the progenitor for a long line of Sikorsky helicopters that are still in production to this day. The first Sikorsky helicopter for the armed forces was the R-4, and this evolved into the Korean War era Sikorsky H-03S, or Horse, as the Navy nicknamed it. The S-51 was the civilian version. And then we have the Army and Air Force version, the H-5. And what you see here is a 1/24th scale Nomoto from Japan Sikorsky H-5. It's an exquisite model, custom built, a wood fuselage with metal fittings for the tail rotor, rotor hub, and landing gear brace. But what I want to call to your attention are the markings. This is unbelievable. The national insignia is a decal. You can see the little vent hole there in the center of the star. But the aircraft number and rotor warning are hand painted. It's a level of craftsmanship that is just unbelievable. The red bars were added to a World War II era national insignia also, and that was painted by hand as well. A trademark of the Nomoto model is the engraved edges of the windows, and this is an easy way to tell. These are very rare, very collectible, and very valuable. Beautiful, beautiful models. Then we come to this machine, first flown in 1948, the Bell 47. This is kind of the quintessential bubble canopy, tail boom, light utility helicopter. It was powered by a 200 horsepower Franklin engine and cruised at 80 miles per hour. Of course, you can't mention the Bell 47 without the TV show Whirlybirds. And here we see Chuck Martin, played by Kenneth Tobey, and little Timmy holding a Swadar H-13. And this helicopter is on skids. This one's on floats. It came as either a kit that you could build or fully assembled. And it was released in 1953, fairly crude by today's standards, but this is the only Bell H-13 or 47 model on the market at that time. It's pretty simple in terms of detail. The floats are nicely done. But now we get to a more advanced version of the 47. This is the G. And the Bell 47G first flew in 1953. This is a more advanced version of the earlier one we just saw. And what we're looking at here is a picture of Mr. Donald Douglas waving down from the cockpit of the first DC-8, Douglas's first jet airliner. And above is a helicopter that, believe it or not, just seconds earlier took this photo. Douglas had a custom-built model of that helicopter seen here. November 35 Delta was the actual number. And this is a unique and rare model from the Museum of Flying, which was originally the Douglas Library. It was restored, and it was originally built by the Bell Model Shop and then finished by the Douglas Model Shop. And what I mean by that is that the construction of the model was done in Bell's Niagara Falls plant. And then the model was finished at Douglas's Santa Monica plant, where the markings were applied and the Douglas logos were applied to the fuel tanks and the tail fin. Here's a detail, and just like the real early 47s, it has wood rotor blades with metal fittings. And as I mentioned, this was restored, but leaning out of that right-hand door would be the Douglas photographer, who would be taking pictures like this. Douglas also had a 47J called the Ranger, and this is a 4-seat helicopter pilot and 3 passengers. It was used to transport executives and pilots in between all the Douglas facilities in Southern California, as well as Palmdale and Edwards Air Force Base. Nice looking helicopter. Now we come to the 47 G2. And this first flew in 1954. It was an advancement of the straight G model. It featured several improvements, such as metal rotor blades instead of wood, and a 260 horsepower Lycoming engine instead of the Franklin 200 horsepower engine. This model was the king of the hill. There was nothing better. It was released in 1975. It's from G-Mark in Japan, 1/20th scale. The fuselage alone measures 18 inches, and it's quite a large model and a ton of detail. It was just really beautiful when it was built up. It came in a box that was quite elaborate. The brass tail boom, landing skids, and rotor head were nestled in a styrofoam cradle. Here's a detail of it. You can see here. And then the plastic parts and the little screws that assembled everything were separate. You've heard of skill level 3, 4, and 5. This would be about a 12. But here's the finished model. And again, quite large, quite elaborate, beautifully detailed. And you can even read the instruments on the panel. You can see the engine here. Those are rubber tires on the landing skids. Detail of the tail rotor. And you can see the engine in all its glory. The twin fuel tanks that gave this helicopter 43-gallon fuel capacity. And there's the rotor head. Again, it's brass, but painted silver. And this brings us to the jet age. Here we see a unique machine which made its first flight in France in 1955. And this is the Alouette 2 turbine-powered helicopter, the world's first production jet helicopter. It was built under license in this country by Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York. And it was called the Lark. They built 25 of these. Here we see one on floats, undergoing a water checkout. And here's a model of the Alouette 2. I built this one myself. It was a kit that I purchased in Paris, France in 1998. And what's really unique about this is that it was found in a little airplane store in downtown Paris. And it was literally a bag of white plastic parts. It had no direction sheet, no decals, but it did have a label on the bag, and that's about all the nomenclature there was. So as you can see, it's 1/30th scale, measures about 10 inches long. But what I did have, thanks to my uncle's career at Republic, was a brochure on the Alouette 2. And this contained all sorts of really good information, lots of detail photos, and that allowed me to build the model as you see here. Painted it up in the Douglas demo colors as well. I'm sorry, Republic demo colors. In 1956, this little helicopter made its first flight, the Hughes, originally the 269, this became the 300. This was used by law enforcement and for sightseeing, and a nice little utility helicopter, great for training as well. And here we have a model made in Italy from metal and plastic. I don't know the name of the manufacturer. If you do, please leave it in the comments. But this is, as I said, an Italian factory model of the Hughes 300 in 1/24th scale. Now we come to this machine. You've seen it in movies. This is the one that flew the Beatles out to Shea Stadium in their 1965 concert in New York. Went into service with New York Airways in 1962. It's the Boeing Vertol 107, a twin-jet 25-passenger commercial helicopter. And what you see here is a custom-built Filipino wood model of the Boeing Vertol 107 in New York Airways colors. It's hand-painted, and it's a custom mahogany model in 1/32nd scale. The fuselage measures 18 inches long. It's a big model. It's not very accurate to the machine, but in this particular case, it was made as a gift for me because I had flown in this many times as a kid in New York. And it does the job. It represents the machine, is very colorful. It's a splashy model, even though it's not accurate. Now, a model that is accurate to the helicopter is this. And yeah, you guessed it. It's a topping of the Pan Am model that you see here. Pan Am had two of them. They were flown by New York Airways crews, but they were operated from the top of the Pan Am building. And it's a 1/72nd scale topping BV-107-2. You see the cockpit detail, and this is much more accurate to the helicopter than the Filipino wood model, but it's smaller. In 1967, this machine made its first flight. It is the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne, developed for the Army as an advanced aerial fire support system, which is a fancy term for gunship. It was called a composite helicopter because it had both a tail rotor and a tail propeller. The Cheyenne, seen here as a factory model, was a rigid rotor helicopter that was very fast, fully aerobatic, but very complicated. And the Army went with Bell's Huey Cobra and eventually the Hughes AH-64 Apache, which is considered a direct descendant of the Cheyenne concept. But this is a Lockheed factory model, subcontracted to a model producer in Southern California. But it's a wood model on a metal and wood base, and it was used as a promotion and given to company executives, Army top brass, and pilots. It's a beautiful model. 1/35th scale, measured about 15 inches long on the fuselage. And finally, we come to the gold standard of light utility helicopters today, the originally called the Aerospatiale A-Star, and this was first flown in 1974. Here we see it in the markings of the LA County Sheriff, and they use this model for promo, and it's called a die-cast metal model. This measures about 10 inches long. It's a die-cast model, which means that once the molds are established, they can be made very economically and in any markings you would ever want. And that's the advantage. So it's used for promotion, and it's a 1/40th scale Eurocopter AS-350 B2. So plastic models. What about those? Well, Revell plastic models in the 1950s, there were a number of kits we're going to see in a moment, but it was the box art that sold the models. So we started with the Sikorsky S-55, and then just a year later, re-released as the H-19 Rescue Copter on floats. Then came the Piasecki H-16 transporter, which was the grandfather of today's Chinook. The Fairey Rotodyne in the early 60s. And re-releases of the S-55 kit as the Marine HRS-1 and the Navy HO-4S-1. Revell got a lot of mileage out of those S-55 molds. But there you have it, a look at helicopter models of all different types and all different eras. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I want to say special thanks to the good folks who made this video possible. Thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. And as always, until next time, take care.